Hello, and welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Arthur, PMW's multimedia editor. This episode of the show is all about brand safety, which has become the big topic of discussion, particularly in the past fortnight, prompted by the headline news that the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, better known as GARM, announced it was discontinuing after Elon Musk's X filed a lawsuit against its parent organisation, the World Federation of Advertisers, better known as the WFA. Now, GARM was a non-profit initiative intended to help members avoid advertising on harmful websites. To discuss why this has happened and the consequences of the news in a little bit more depth, I'm joined by Fiona Salmon, the Managing Director of Mantis, a brand safety and contextual product that uses AI-powered solutions to try and create a more precise and transparent advertising ecosystem. So being an expert on all things brand safety, Fiona walks us through exactly why X's lawsuit against the WFA prompted GARM to be discontinued, how marketers should respond to the news, where to next for the world of brand safety and suitability with regard to ad placements, and what other tools and solutions are out there for advertisers looking to ensure their ads are placed in environments they deem to be brand safe. Joining us before that discussion, however, is PMW's editor Robin Langford, who's back on the show for the first time post-Cannes, embracing the comfort of our Twickenham studio to take us all on a whistle-stop tour of the latest news and headlines from the world of performance marketing. Anyone who has been following PMW lately will know that there's been a ton of breaking news across the site, and perhaps understandably, a few of you maybe have fallen a little bit behind. So Robin briefly catches us all up by giving us a quick little insight into all the headlines you may have but can't afford to miss. So you've all got that to look forward to, followed by our in-depth brand safety discussion with Fiona Salmon. As always, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. Robin Langford, welcome to the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast studio. First episode since Cannes Lion. How does it feel to be back in the nice, cosy comfort of Twickenham?
It's still nice and hot and nice and warm at the moment, but it's almost as manic as Cannes still, I feel.
We were saying it's been the talk of the town, certainly across PMW's editorial team. Usually post-Cannes, it's super chaotic and hectic, and you sort of return there towards the end of June, and perhaps July and August, some people go on holiday, things get a little bit quieter on the news front, but certainly has not been the case since Cannes, has it?
No, in the journalist world, August is sometimes referred to as silly season, where they bring out the silly stories because there's not much hard news. But there has been lots of news happening in the last few weeks, particularly in the advertising industry.
And a lot of that has been centered around big tech, as per usual, which you'll get into, but also brand safety seems to be becoming a bit more of a regular theme across the headlines. So for these first 10 minutes of the show, before we jump into our feature interview coming up in a few moments with Fiona Salmon from Mantis, she's their managing director, why don't you just give us a little bit of a rundown about some of the news pieces that have cropped up, particularly in the last fortnight, and why big tech and brand safety are the two big things everyone's focused on.
Sure, absolutely, Joe. I mean, I'm going to try and attempt a whistle-stop tour through some of the biggest stories in the last 2 weeks. The great benefit you have as listeners to this podcast is you just need to go onto our news tab on PMW for a bit of a more detailed explanation of some of these things. But what we've seen in the last 2 weeks is one of the crescendos of the Google Department of Justice trial in America. Google was found to have violated a US antitrust law with its search business, and no solution was put forward by Judge Amit Mahar. He's a US District Court judge for Columbia. But there were three things that could happen after this. Number one, Google could be forced to change the way it operates. It could be forced to restrict default search agreements. Or, and this is the one that's really big, and people have speculated in the past, it could be forced to sell part of its adtech business. We spoke to a lot of experts about this. People are quite sceptical how much will change. There's a lot more stuff going on in the courts, but it could really affect the way Adland works, because that's pretty much the biggest part of the performance marketing industry, Google search business.
So the crux of that finding from the DOJ is to do with Google essentially being monopoly.
Yeah, the really interesting part, it actually found that what the court found most troubling about Google was the idea of having deals as default search engines for other platforms. And it kind of went under the radar this year, but we found out that in 2022, Google paid Apple £20 billion to be its default search engine on Safari. And a lot of people that use Apple, use iPhone, iOS, aren't always aware that the results they get back are from Google. And the court found that may have been monopolistic practice in terms of it blocked other search engines from having that. So, yeah, lots of sort of unpick from that one we see.
And just quickly, it's the US DOJ, so any implications from the trial, will that strictly be US based, or is that going to have a more broader worldwide implication?
Well,
as well?
I think it is it's US based because I think it's the US government that made the complaint. They were the ones that the court was acting on behalf of as the prosecutor. So we'll see how it might have a further effects. I think the EU will have different jurisdictions over Google, and it already has different regulations within that respect.
An astoundingly big news cycle for Google recently. And it's pretty much astonishing that the next couple of stories we're going to talk about aren't actually related to the cookie deprecation news of the last fortnight. You can go back to the previous episode of the podcast to dive into that. But Robin, what else has cropped up in the news lately?
Big one in the e-commerce world. Amazon has struck a partnership with TikTok and Pinterest, two of the largest social platforms, to have an in-app payments system. I think you covered this one, Joe. This is a big move because, again, it kind of draws that battle line and that lower funnel for performance marketers, that final conversion, particularly in the e-commerce payments world. Being able to be on a TikTok app and using your Amazon account to buy something through that or through Pinterest can really sort of raise the game in terms of those places as an e-commerce destination and that lower funnel marketing activity where, because that's a big thing where all of us are shoppers when we try and buy something. I think it's an underrated area of marketing, that ease of purchase right at the end can really put people off. I know I do when I suddenly have to get out my credit card deets.
Now that's an interesting one because I did cover that, and it's again US based, but what's most interesting is it's an expansion of an existing partnership essentially that was already in place with Meta. So this had been trialed for a few months now, since I believe the end of 2023, across Facebook and Instagram. Now the partnership includes TikTok and Pinterest, and you can only imagine that we may soon be seeing it extend beyond just the US, or perhaps not with GDPR in place across Europe, but we never know. It's certainly for those US based e-commerce marketers, it's exciting news.
It's that single sign-on, last click world. Google, Amazon and Apple Pay, Google Pay, Amazon, all trying to be that one destination where you can buy everything from. Which kind of leads me on to the whole world of brand safety, Elon Musk and everything else, which has also been swirling around in the last 2 weeks in marketing. In terms of Musk is also trying to get payments apps onto Twitter. He's always wanted.
What isn't he trying to do with Twitter or X?
I know. And I'm on a hiding for nothing because the moment we talk about Elon Musk on this podcast, he's going to do something else outlandish that makes us all out of date.
We're recording this about 3 or 4 days in advance of the episode going live, and that's an awfully long time in the world of journalism.
And I understand we've got Fiona Salmon from Mantis on as an expert. I'm very grateful that we can talk to her in more detail about this rather than me. But yeah, there's a whole world of people wanting to dominate that sort of payments apps, and Musk is in there. We won't talk about GARM too much because I know Fiona's going to talk about that. But on a broader subject, which GARM was all about, which is brand safety, a lot has been swirling around. And this story kind of went under the radar, but the global CEO of Group M, Christian Jewell, who is exiting, he gave a testimony at the Senate Judiciary Committee in the US recently. And what was interesting about this is he said that 1% of their clients' ad spend goes to online news outlets. That's an incredibly small number. So that's like all the big, Wall Street Journal and stuff. Their advertisers aren't really spending on hard news. And there is revealed to be a bit of an aversion to that, which is interesting compared to the sort of spend on social media, for example. And the fear is that a lot of brands are worried about appearing alongside hard news, things like war, things that are controversial, the awful word culture wars, things like that. Brands don't want to be, and they can't control the news. So they often, you'll notice with things like sport, they spend a lot more money on that because it's a little bit more bankable. Sport has become the last bastion of monoculture as opposed to news and stuff, which can be quite divisive, and brands don't always want to spend on it. But it's interesting because in terms of brand safety, there's a bit of a fallacy going on that actually there's a lot of research that's showing that most people see adverts on news aren't actually put off, even if it's next to a hard news story. We have Ofcom and Lumen research found that actually social media exposes people to a narrower range of news topics than traditional news. And then a Walk study found that ads adjacent to stories considered not brand safe, but in a trusted news environment, there wasn't any drop-off in the way consumers saw those adverts, and they actually still had purchase intent. So I think there's a bit of a fallacy going on with a lot of brands. And with the whole thing around X and GARM and brand safety at the moment, I think a lot of advertisers might need to reconsider their spend on actual news publishers and respected news publishers particularly.
A bit more bankable than perhaps they think.
Yeah, and so that leads us on quite nicely to talk about GARM, which I understand your guest is going to be talking about.
Absolutely, Robin. Thank you very much for joining us up top of this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. Always a pleasure to have you in the studio, and I think you did very well there, giving us a synthesized whistle-stop tour of the last fortnight of news in the world of advertising and performance marketing. Thank you very much for joining me. And as you said, we're now going to jump to our discussion with Fiona Salmon, the Managing Director of Mantis. Robin, thanks again.
Thank you, Joe.
Fiona Salmon.
Hello.
Thank you very much for joining me today in the Performance Marketing Unlocked studio. How are you doing?
Good.
You were saying it was a bit of a journey to get here. You were coming from the southeast.
I was coming from the southeast all the way across to Twickenham. There's no easy route. You just have to suck it up.
We were saying off air, I've since moved closer to Twickenham since joining PMW, but I did used to live out in the southeast as well, and it really can be a journey too. For any of our Londoners listening, you know, really hard to get across South London without having to go in and out first. So it can
It's
be a bit
much easier, isn't it? In and then out. But if you're driving, you want to come diagonally across. It's all A roads and super slow.
We appreciate you making the journey though.
Happy to be here.
Exciting news. And we're here for an important reason as well, because in the world of marketing and advertising, there's been some big news that's happened in the past week, that being the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, better known as GARM, announced it was discontinuing after Elon Musk's X filed a lawsuit against its parent organisation, the World Federation of Advertisers, better known as the WFA. Big news across the advertising front.
Isn't it just? Big news. Yes.
And we want to touch on today some of the consequences of this. Now, you work for Mantis, and they're all across brand safety and suitability. AI powered as well, super exciting. Now, you haven't been with Mantis very long, but you are well positioned to speak on this news, I suppose is the best way to put it. And I think the best way to start might be talking about why X's lawsuit against the WFA prompted GARM to be discontinued. Why has one thing led to another?
Sure. Well, if you think about it, I mean, GARM just didn't have the funds to continue. You know, so that's why that part of WFA has been closed down. Super sad, I think, especially as, you know, it's been put to kind of help brands and advertisers make more conscious decisions about how to place their ads in a brand safe environment. It had 40 brands as part of that GARM community. And, you know, Mantis is using the GARM taxonomy. Lots of people use the GARM taxonomy. And in fact, up until July, I think, X was actually still part of that community. So all of the platforms had signed up to it, the framework, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a surprise. This is a surprise to everyone in the industry, I think.
And that's the sentiment, certainly, from the other experts I've spoken on this, is just that it's a real shame. I mean, Cannes Lion, GARM headlined part of that. They announced new sustainability standards. So they were doing a lot of good, I suppose, in the industry. But yeah, the resources weren't in abundance for GARM, that's for sure. I think limited resources, from what I've read, they were staffed by only 2 full-time employees as well. So I suppose they're just the first element to go now that the WFA's facing a big old lawsuit that's going to come with a lot of legal funding for the US Department of Justice.
Yeah, so I'm glad you touched on the sustainability part. In my previous role, part of my time was sustainability lead there. And I was so excited that GARM was releasing their sustainability framework. It's been long anticipated. So the fact that that is published and it's out there, hopefully it will still be adhered to. And I'm hoping that the taxonomy that's been created through the GARM framework for brand safety will still be continued. pretty sure we'll still be using it at Mantis because it's a framework that's easy to understand. It's built on a sort of RAG system, and it's there for the greater good.
The good work GARM had done remains, and so people can still look to that for guidance and support. It's just a shame that going forward we'll have to look for alternative solutions, and we'll get into those a little later on the show. But on the lawsuit itself, perhaps you could enlighten us a little bit more further as to exactly what it is X has claimed against the WFA that's prompted this whole thing.
Okay, so listen, I'm going to consult my notes here because I want to get it correct. So X has accused GARM and the WFA of defamation, claiming biased and non-transparent practices labelled their platform unsafe for advertisers. So that's the beef that they have. As to how accurate that is, I have it on good authority that WFA is going to continue to fight the litigation because they know that that's incorrect. So there's kind of, let's watch this space of how that continues. But let's hope somebody takes up the GARM mantle, one of the bodies or, areas that really care about this stuff for brands. And let's hope that, like I said, that framework still continues, maybe under an umbrella of a different organisation, who knows? But a lot of work went into that, and it was doing some really good stuff.
Certainly, regardless of the outcome of the lawsuit, there's going to be a big hole to fill across the industry in terms of all the work that GARM was doing. I'm interested, Fiona, now you contributed some thoughts to PMW's analysis and reaction piece to this news, and you were very sympathetic towards X's employees. And I'd just like you to elaborate a little bit more on that. I think it was a very interesting place to go, and it wasn't something many of the other commentators did, was look internally within X. And you spoke about they might be embarrassed to talk about the situation and the fact that they're employed at that company. So just elaborate a little bit further on why your thoughts first went there.
Yeah, so listen, I know people at X, and I know people that are currently interviewing at X, and they feel conflicted. I'm not going to name any names, but, just put yourself in their position. You've been working at a company for really quite some time. You've seen it go through a new change of ownership. And then all of a sudden, almost turning on a piece of framework, really, that is supposed to keep the brand's advertising safe as it can be in this really complex programmatic ecosystem. So my thoughts turned to them. And I suppose, my comment was probably more on the side of the people that work there, right? And the people that might be working there in the future. If you were interviewing for X right now, would you continue with that interview? How does it make you feel that a company of that size with a really strong leader could do this to an area of the industry that was built because it was required? I just really thought about how conflicted they must feel. And I felt for them, to be honest.
I do think those sort of the Twitter into X stands that have been with the company for prior to Elon Musk's takeover. I mean, I can only imagine how turbulent a time it might have been and all the ups and downs they have to go through. And obviously, it would be a very interesting environment to work at. I'd be incredibly curious to be interviewing for positions there and to go into that company just to see how things work. But I can imagine it would be very conflicting, even prior to this news, to just sort of weigh up all the pros and cons that would come to joining a company in the state that X is in. I mean, we don't need to go into depth on the beef Elon has with advertisers, but that's pretty known within the industry. Looking outside of X and those within the WFA and GARM itself, what about the broader industry, marketers and advertisers? How do you think they should be responding to the news?
Yeah, so listen, it's always, in my opinion, up to a brand to kind of know as much as they can about where they're advertising, right? So that should continue. Where they choose to spend should continue to be that way. I find Musk might have an issue or a frustration if brands aren't spending with his platform at the moment, but that's their decision, and it will always remain their decision. It's up to brands to really understand where they're placing their ads. Obviously, there's brand safety vendors that they can use in order to do that. But even up until recently, there's been some analytics by Dr. Augustine Fo's company, Adlytics, that has called into question some of the methodology or the outcomes that other brand safety tools are using. I think what's important is that everyone's really trying in this space. And hopefully we can start looking towards new technologies that work a little differently, maybe sort of on the publisher side before thinking about what the article contains. Is it a brand safe article or not? Should it be allowed to be biddable? So there's new technologies out there. Mantis is one of them that is looking at the brand safety perspective from a different lens, looking at it actually from a pre-publishing lens as to whether that article is a safe article to be biddable or not.
Now, Mantis itself was built by Reach PLC, which is a big publisher here in the UK, but also in the US, and they've been undergoing expansions out there for quite some time now. So you've got a very good perspective on the publisher side of things here. And what is there to be said for the need to invest in ensuring your ads are placed in safe environments? Because we've seen a lot of Analytics have done reports into Fortune 500 companies having their ads placed on these sort of illicit and negative and sometimes very, very harmful, sensitive websites. And a lot of that reaction was sort of, the blame was placed on Google, and Google needs to do better to ensure that they're serving these companies what they promise. But does the responsibility lie a little bit more on publishers, brands, advertisers, these organizations to ensure that they know exactly where all of their ads are being placed? What's to be said for publishers like Reach that are really big multinationals?
So I agree. Listen, the two most important people in the chain is the brand and the publisher or the platform. And it's really important that those two parts really understand where and who they're advertising to. As I said, I can speak at length from the publisher perspective. I think it's really important that editors live by their code of conduct. Editors have policies. We have policies at Reach as to what we will and won't publish. And we know that if something is sensitive, it won't be biddable because our Mantis tool prevents it from being biddable. Likewise, on the brand side, it's really important that they understand and take responsibility over where they are investing. It's not right that brands can end up investing in hate speech or really sensitive videos or article content. It's also not great if they don't understand why and how they're doing it. But as I touched on earlier, the programmatic ecosystem has become so convoluted and confusing in some situations that actually there can be many hops in the chain at which you can lay blame. And I think that's kind of really concerning. I remember back in the old days selling advertising slots on print magazines and newspapers. The occasional bad placement happened. You know, there's examples of aeroplane brands being put next to aeroplane crashes, and that was a flat planning problem. And that was when it was a lot easier. Now there's just zillions of ads being placed, and not everybody knows exactly where they're ending up. And I think that's still a problem. Brand safety vendors that are currently out there have taken the kind of line of, let's say, overblocking, so using keyword lists, overblocking article content that is actually safe. At Reach, they had a lot of their Euro content blocked by overzealous brand safety tools, which was safe, and it was for words like shoot, shoot out, shot. We need technology that understands more about the context of the page so that shoot and shot in the framework of football is safe. But if it's also involving, I don't know, car park or knife or pedestrian, it's unsafe. And I think that it's now up to people to really sort of stand by good technology that can really understand context of a page. And that is where Mantis is trying to help. It's
such a double-edged sword because obviously there's great consequences that come with negative ad placements on brand perception and these outcomes. And you mentioned some examples there in terms of the flight advertisements next to flight crashes. But why brand safety is such a point of concern. And there was data that was released this week and it was published on P&W from WARC, the Future of Programmatic 2024 report. In terms of advertisers and agencies' top programmatic concerns for the year ahead, brand safety and suitability is the number one. 60% of advertisers and agencies are concerned about brand safety. And I don't think it's all to do with negative ad placements, but it's what you're talking about here, where there's an overcorrection in the other direction, where you sort of are then losing potential ad revenue and you're wasting your ad spend where ads are then getting blocked where they shouldn't be. And the Euro stuff's a really, really good example. So how do you strike that balance?
So absolutely. I mean, and also it's a loss of audience, so brands want to reach...
It's a loss of everything. It's a disaster.
Brands, an absolute disaster. Brands want to reach audiences. Let's take the Euros, for example. There's all sorts of supermarket chains doing specific promos around England matches. And then they find they can't actually place their ads around the England content. I mean, super frustrating. We've seen the same reflected in our Olympics content too. Paris was still on a lot of keyword block lists from the bombings a few years back. And this is the thing, keyword lists do serve a purpose, but someone's got to manage those keyword lists and remove Paris, when when that news is no longer breaking or fresh in people's minds. Otherwise, you are blocking significant amounts of content that you actually want to be around or your brands want to be around. So I think, first of all, it's making sure that people are keeping on top of their keyword list. If they're using a vendor that does rely a lot on a keyword list, then it needs to be somebody's responsibility to add and remove keywords, but also to remember to remove them.
Active, not passive management.
Active, not passive. And do you know what? It's quite difficult to know where that responsibility lies, whether it lies with an agency or whether it lies with a brand, and every setup is different. So that's a bit of a mess. Or it's working with a technology that can understand more about the page, the sentiment of a page, and like I explained earlier, that certain keywords within certain topic areas are safe, and therefore that article is deemed safe.
Okay, so looking ahead then, and we're touching on some of the ways we can go, but what can your typical brand, publisher, advertiser, marketer, anyone listening to this, what can they go out and do to improve their brand safety, particularly in the wake of GARM being discontinued, which was really helping with its guidelines beyond both sustainability, with brand safety, suitability. They were helping in a lot of ways. They're not going to be there anymore. What can we do? What are the other solutions out there? Are there any other guidelines people can look to? How can they find better management? Is it looking beyond keyword lists? Is there new technology out there that's going to help?
Yeah, so listen, it's AI. We knew we'd get there eventually.
But we've got faith in AI to do this already, because we're already talking about and there's already been bugaboos from AI in this sense and in every other sense across the industry. And I guess implication of AI, from what I've spoken about a lot, is happening internally within organizations first before it goes out there and externally starts doing these jobs that are very, very important. So you've got the faith in AI to come on and do this?
I have. Otherwise, I wouldn't have joined Mantis, because it's got an AI core. So we work with IBM Watson, and we've been using this technology at Reach for nearly 5. Actually, it's our 5th year birthday this month.
Happy birthday.
August. Happy birthday, Mantis. So that technology's been proven across the newspaper environment, right? So not only do brands have overzealous, if you like, keyword block lists, but some brands are now just not advertising in news for the reasons that you mentioned, is that they're fearful that these block lists aren't going to be working and that they are going to be next to some potentially harmful content. Again, it's up to the editors as to what is published, and there's code of conduct to follow there. But yeah, I think AI can really help in this situation. And the reason it can is because we're not in print anymore. I'm not taking flat plans over to editors to kind of make sure the ads flow with the editorial, as I used to for many years. There's now millions of impressions per sort of semisecond or whatever. We can't keep control of it. So we need to have big technology, LLMs, etc., that can understand at scale what is safe and what isn't safe.
Learns fast, I'll give it that.
It does
learns fast. It's very active in its management, so it does instantly, its capabilities resolve a lot of the trepidations, I suppose, in current issues.
Absolutely. And I'd say make sure that you're working with a technology partner that is still upholding the GARM framework, because the GARM framework was put in for many good reasons, and it should remain. Fine, it might be called something else. And let's be honest, if the WFA win, then there's no reason that they wouldn't resurrect GARM in the future. So hopefully it's just a closed for now and not forever. And I do think that people need to, look and refresh at their keyword lists. Consider whether their brand safety partner is doing good and right for them, especially over the platforms and publishers that they're wanting to spend with. But also try to get with the main publishers and platforms, get a direct relationship going. And there's different vendors out there. Mantis can work on behalf of a brand as well as it can work on behalf of a publisher. We've got a couple of brands actually at Reach that are now adopting Mantis as their preferred partner in brand safety and asking other platforms and publishers that they work with outside of Reach to also adopt the technology. So we know it's working really, really well.
Now, Reach wouldn't have first-hand experience of this. As you mentioned, you said some of Reach's publications, Euro's stories, struggled a little bit in terms of the overzealous overcorrection of shoot and shooting, so they lost those ad placements. What's been learned from that experience internally within Reach? Is there an example of a case of we've learned from this and here's how we're going to correct it into the future?
Well, the learning is Mantis, and going to the advertisers that want to spend around it and trying to educate them that they didn't spend around it because their technology from their side, if you like, or from the campaign's side, didn't allow for the placement. It's a retrospect, but we can see this happening live. So actually Mantis can tell a publisher why that article's being blocked and for what keywords, and then they can actually have a live conversation if they know it's a brand that really wants to be around that content and that trending content that's kind of hot right now, and they can call it out and hopefully get that keyword or whatever removed from the block list that it's on.
It's a really important one, education. I think it's a really good point that you've raised, because one of the big issues from a publisher perspective, lack of advertising spend on those websites, is there is a little bit of this fear that investment in publishing just isn't going to pay off as much for advertisers. And I think knocking back some of that rhetoric's really, really important, and knowing that it is still a place worthy of ad investment, and these publishers are putting a lot of time and effort into ensuring that ad placements go in appropriate places.
Oh God, not only that, but listen, it's ensuring the open web remains open, right? I don't want my 3 kids thinking that TikTok is a news source, right? I want them to be able to read quality journalism. And to be honest with you, I've been in publishing my whole life. I've either worked in adtech, which supports publisher revenue, or working at blue chip publishers myself. And I think it's incredibly important that the open web remains, that quality journalism is invested in by brands, because it's a whole audience that's not going to go away. People have interests and hobbies and like to read news stories. And it's really important that it's still there. So I think making sure that you feel confident with a brand safety vendor, making sure that you're still investing in the open web is hugely important for like learning, our children's learning, and just keeping updated with what's going on.
If I could ask you to postulate on one thing on just a personal perspective, and it's something that I wrote about this week in my most recent column, is do you have faith in the industry to have the ability and the time, put the time and effort in to learn about these things and then invest accordingly? Because I put a lot of the industry on blast this week in my monthly column, talking about the reaction to the cookie deprecation news from Google, being that third-party cookies are going to be hanging around. And a lot of advertisers were really celebrating that news because they use third-party cookies all the time. And I've gone on put them on blast and said, well, you need to be looking at first-party data solutions anyway, because they're better for the consumers. They serve them more relevant, personalized, targeted ads. There's a litany of different reasons. There's over 25 cookieless solutions. It's lazy and it's ignorant, and it's going to hurt you in the long run, consumers in the short term, if you don't go out there and invest. And then looking at more data that was published across the site this week, according to Walk data, walled garden investment is outpacing investment in the open web, which again is another one where, you're just exhausted. Advertisers, you've got to take the time to try and put your money in. Sometimes it might have a little bit more of a cost up front, but a payoff further down the line. I just think, particularly as the economy coming out of the pandemic's been in a massive downturn, it's now starting to shift up a little bit more. huge amounts of advertisers are just very short-term orientated in their approach to everything across the board. We could even talk about sustainability on that front too. But do you have the faith in the industry to look more long-term and do the right thing? Because from what I see as a journalist at the moment, it's very short-term orientated. And I think that rhetoric has got to shift, and maybe it will as the economy gets better.
Yeah, so listen, I reported on the IPA Bellwether report. Actually, things are looking a lot better than they have in the last few years. So let's hope that the investment still continues into the open web. Yes, it's been on the downturn for many years, actually. You only have to look at what's going on in my household with regards to talking about short term. I mean, short term spend from brands, but short attention space, man, from the next generation.
Oh boy.
To ask them to sort of sit down and read a chapter book right now is super tough. They just love quick snippets of YouTube videos, of Instagram reels, of, you know, their attention span is like 2 to 3 seconds long. If it hasn't kind of caught their attention, they've moved on and off. And I think that's really worrying for just human behavior, let alone whether, you know, the open web as we know it is still going to be here in sort of 10, 20 years. It's 30 years since the first display ad went out next month, I think.
Wow.
And
another big birthday.
It's a big birthday, isn't it? And what an interesting 30 years it's been. Where are we going to be in 30 years from now? Are we all just going to be getting our news from platforms? Is there going to be no one, signing up to journalism degrees anymore? I'd love to look at that as a topic, because my kids certainly don't really understand what journalism is, but they're pretty young at the moment. They really care about. My God, my daughter, who's 10, actually asked me if she could start a YouTube channel last night. And I said, what about? And she said, my guinea pigs. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, okay, so who's going to watch that? And she said, well, I watch tons of it. And I was like, do you? Oh my God, okay, do you? She said, yeah, and then I can earn some money.
On YouTube. I'll tell you what, that's an oversaturated market for anyone looking to jump in.
Specifically guinea pigs? Or?
Specifically guinea pigs might be the way in. That's a very niche interest, absolutely.
So, totally niche, and she seems to know a lot about it. But, I think there's something else brewing there in the generations to come. This whole kind of idea of not sort of sitting down reading a full-page article, not sitting down taking the time to really understand a piece of news or the background to something and why something's happening. That's obviously a much bigger issue, but that's where my mind goes to at the moment. Long form content, long form videos, etc., etc. Ads don't want to appear next to that. They want to appear next to short form. Ad pages are cluttered with ads. At Reach, we've got really crowded pages at the moment, and that's because the value exchange there is ads for quality editorial journalism. And I think that's still quite hard for the younger generations maybe to grasp. So lots of things actually that we could discuss on that point, because one thing I think really leads to another. But back to your main point about this kind of really short-termist, I don't see that going away, actually. And I'm a massive believer in the open web. But I think it's going to look quite different over the years to come, for good or for bad. I'm not sure yet.
The big thing with the internet, with advertisers, with marketers, where we've got to give them their credit and their due, is the industry is incredibly good at adapting to new circumstances, and it always finds a way through. And you speak on those Bellwether reports and the AA Walk reports as well. Marketing and performance has been propping up large parts of the UK economy for some time now. So it always finds a way to make sure that it sustains itself. And we can only hope that it does so in the future. I mean, journalism's a whole nother conversation. We'll have to see how that unfolds. I know both us, we're sitting here sweating, and it's not just because the lights we've got here recording us. But it'll be fascinating to see. And you can touch on so many different things on now ad-funded models in streaming and across Netflix and Disney have become really critical for those streamers and other streamers getting involved. You think about AVOD and fast streaming and all of those services. And you can only think now TikTok is spending a lot of investment in basically becoming a search engine, which in a lot of ways I think it is. It more or less, it absolutely has. And, as a competitor to Google, and who thought that was going to happen when we first saw it? But in the US, maybe 4 or 5 years from now, it won't exist anymore. Yeah. So we have no idea what's going to happen. All we can do is sit here and postulate. And Fiona, I thank you very much for your time sitting here doing that. We are running low, though, on time, so we're going to have to pivot into hopefully something a little bit lighter, and we can end on a high here and enjoy the last couple of minutes of this episode with a classic PMW Resell Me a Pen challenge. So Fiona, would you like to reveal to me what it is, what outdated product or service you're going to be reselling?
It's the analog camera.
The analog camera.
Specifically a Polaroid.
Oh,
analog.
Polaroids. Okay. Oh. Yeah. You love an old Polaroid,
Who doesn't love an old Polaroid? So this was such an easy choice for me. About 3 weeks ago, all the kids were in the garden. It was one of the Sundays. Again,
if we jump in, I'm going to cut you off just so I can get the clock up for you. I do this every episode. I forget to start timing
right,
people.
Okay, so it's got to be 60 seconds. Yeah? Okay.
Let me pull up my laptop and get a...
60 seconds, right, that's all I've got.
60 seconds on the clock.
Okay.
And your time starts now.
Okay, fine. So 3 weeks ago, my nephew came round, and for his birthday, he'd been given it's basically like a Polaroid camera. He's 6. And showing his cousins, my kids, they couldn't believe that they could get a tangible photograph out of a camera because they've only grown up with digital cameras where they flip round and want to see immediately what the photo looks like. But for them to have something tangible to hold, to then pin on their pin boards over their bed that evening about something that happened that day, they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And I just think that whole memento of creating photo albums and all of that has really been lost. You know, now it's just all on our phone. We rarely print them off. I'm pretty good at it. I use an app called Chatbooks. So every time I favourite a photo, it then stores them for me. And then when it gets to a certain amount, it sends me a book of those photos.
Amazing. Couple of seconds to time there as well, right at the end. Almost cut you off. The Polaroid camera, what I love about that is take the photo, the immediate print out, give it a little bit of a shake, and you've got yourself something physical almost instantly.
That beautiful vignette that it has, you just, the filter on those Polaroids are just so romantic and so gorgeous. And I like
that you've gone there because we had an episode a few months ago now with Co-op, and Dean Harris spoke about the slightly more old school camera where you've got the wind up, and you wind up and you take the shots and you don't know what they are, and you've got to go out and get those printed out later. And
most of them are useless.
Well, that's the thing. You get back a bunch of shots, you don't really know what you're going to get. The thing I do like about the Polaroid, as you've gone there, is you take an image and you get it right then and there, so you can have that look, but you still get the added suspense of waiting for a little bit. Oh, is the shot going to be good? Everyone's cowering over to get a look as it develops. Then you have a look and you go, all right, maybe we need to go again, or maybe we've got that. We've nailed that in one try. So I think that's a really, really good one. And the Polaroid's one that's just slowly, from my sort of childhood into adulthood and from parties and social events, it's now become something very old school. And it's always exciting when one pops up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something great for the fridge, putting a Polaroid.
Yeah, straight up there. The kids absolutely loved it.
I'm glad the kids loved it. I'm glad something old school is slightly outdated and not optimized for efficiency and doing the most as possible in the shortest amount of time. The kids enjoyed. So that's a nice uplifting one to end on, Fiona.
And the sun was actually shining that one day 3 weeks ago.
Amazing. Can't ask for any more. Fiona, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
No problem.
And that concludes this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. Big thank you to Fiona Salmon for joining us there to talk about brand safety and suitability, exactly what happened with GARM being discontinued there, and what does the future of brand safety look like. As always, some terrific insights from our experts, so thanks to Fiona for joining the show. Also need to thank our editor, Robin Langford, who's just about the busiest man in the world at the moment with all the news that's breaking across the world of performance. We really appreciate him catching us all up on all the big news headlines of the past fortnight. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you, the loyal listener, for tuning in each and every fortnight as you do. Please, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, and if you're so inclined, leave us a positive rating and review. We'll be back in a fortnight's time with another episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. In the meantime, have an amazing week. Bye for now.